Welcome everybody to our webinar about garden phlox with National Garden Bureau. I'm Diane Blazek with National Garden Bureau, and we have named 2022 the Year of the Garden Phlox for our perennial class. And we wanted to have this webinar in June because June is Perennial Gardening Month. And with us today, we have two panelists from Walters Gardens. We have Gail Pabst as well from our offices. So what we wanted to do is introduce our panelists, and then we can get started showing some really pretty pictures that they have provided. My one quick tip to everybody when you're on this webinar is if you go up in your upper right corner and mark it to speaker view, then you won't see near as many people with just black backgrounds and white names on it. You will actually be able to see the faces of our speakers. So that's my little tip. As far as housekeeping, if you have any questions, please put those in the meeting chat function. We will be monitoring the questions. If you post something there, and I know it's something that's on our question list that we just haven't gotten to yet, that I have further down on the list, we will get it asked and hopefully answered. So with that, I think what I want to do is introduce our panelists, and then I will let you guys talk a little bit more about yourselves and your company. So we have Laura Robles from Walters Gardens, and we have Caitlin Splotsky. Did I get that right?
Splotsky, yeah.
Okay. My apologies there. With a last name like Blazek, you know, I have this Czechoslovakian name also. Sometimes it's Blazek. So I will turn it over to the two of you to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I'm Laura, and I am currently a regional product manager for Walters Gardens. So I basically travel around and visit with our customers who are in the mid-Atlantic region of the country.
And I'm Caitlin Splotsky. I am the trial manager here at Walters Gardens. So we get information, growing information, and collect data on all of the new varieties of plants that Walters will put out each year so that we have that information ready to go for you.
That's awesome. I was going to ask to explain what a trial manager is, because I'm sure a lot of people don't quite understand what goes on and the in-depth data that you take and the number of varieties that you trial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Laura's going to talk a little bit about the culture pages that are on our website, but the information and the data that we collect goes right into those culture sheets. So that you know the best way to grow the plants.
Yeah. And would one of you like to explain the two websites that Gail has just posted the links in the chat? So explain the differences between the two websites and where people might find this information.
Sure. So the one that is just waltersgardens.com, that website is actually more geared towards our industry. So it's more towards our customers. That is where the culture site, the cultural pages that Caitlin referenced are located, but those are really more geared towards our customers who are growing the plants in containers for you to buy at the retail stores. You're welcome to jump on the website and look through it. There's a lot of really awesome information on there. But the other one, the perennialresource.com, is what is probably more well suited to gardeners and homeowners. It's not geared towards the industry. It has information about kind of perennials in general, about proven winners, and there's even a link on there where you can find retailers that carry the perennial plants that we offer as young plants to them. So both really great websites, but the perennial resource one might be a little bit better.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to start by showing some very pretty pictures. To me, I find pictures are most invigorating and inspiring. So we will start with this. I do have the first page here being our Phlox, Year of the Phlox logo. And we change this up every year. Every year it's a new perennial, every year it's a new annual, etc. throughout our program. So I will move to the first screen and you ladies can take this over and talk about your varieties.
Yeah, so I tried to kind of have it in order in terms of bloom time. So we have phlox in our catalog and in our program that kind of go into 3 different categories. The first of that would be all of the creeping type phlox. And within the creeping type phlox, the Spring Bling series is the one that starts to bloom the earliest. So we have 3 colors. This particular one on the screen is called Pink Sparkles. And I think we had one more on the next slide. Ruby Riot. And then there's one other one that we didn't have a picture of in here called Rose Quartz. But anyway, these 3 colors, they're the earliest of the creeping type phlox to bloom within our program, earlier than traditional Phlox subulata is. And the other nice thing about them is that they all have a little bit larger flower size than traditional Phlox subulata, especially the Pink Sparkles that was on the first slide. Those flowers can be up to about 1 inch in diameter. So nice large flowers and nice, cheery, springy colors. And then if we skip on over that one, the next one that is, to occur in terms of bloom time would be the Mountainside series. So within that one, we have 2 colors. We have this Crater Lake that's a really pretty periwinkle blue type coloration. And then we have one called Majestic Magenta. We didn't picture it either. That's more of a, a deep pinkish color. And these are slightly smaller flowers, slightly later to bloom, but still really pretty. And go ahead to the next one. You want to talk about the last couple bits?
Sure. So we've got a few Phlox subulata varieties. Our newest one is Drummond's Pink. That one has a really nice deep pink color, really great flower coverage on that one as far as subulatas go. Let's see, I think we had eyeshadow. So we have 2 others that are kind of in the, that we've got eyeshadow and eye candy, kind of referencing that the markings at the eye of the flower. So you can see on eyeshadow there, it's got some nice little purple markings, and eye candy has the same effect. It's just a different color.
Sorry, I jumped ahead. I was looking to see if we had eye candy.
So those are both really good performers as well. Similar flower coverage to Drummond's Pink, just a little softer, more pastel colors on those. And then we've got North Hills, which is a really solid performer, an older variety, but giving that really clean white and a good bloom time on that one too. Stays blooming for several weeks. Yeah.
I have one quick question here, because I know we're going to go from this to the upright garden phlox. Is one color of creeping phlox more reliable than another? Someone has a sister in New York, and she observed that she sees more pinks than bluish lavenders in that climate.
I think it depends. It depends probably more on what the parentage is into the plant necessarily than what the color is, but some colors are linked, I think, more to specific parents. So in certain areas of the country, the color and that parentage might be linked to create, a more or less vigorous plant. But I don't know if you can always correlate the color with that or not.
Okay. And as far as more vigorous or anything, does it matter which color flower? Are they all about the same as far as vigor and bloom time?
Yeah, I don't really see necessarily that correlation with color there either. I mean, some, there's some pinks that are really super vigorous. There's some, more darker pinks there's some eyed ones that are. I don't necessarily think you can make that distinction based on color.
So they're all good. They're all beautiful. Okay. Sorry. You can go back now to North Hills. I just wanted to make sure I got that question in.
Yeah. I mean, North Hills is a great one. It's kind of your standard subulata type and a really strong performer. I don't know if I have much to add about it.
Yep, no, that's good. I don't remember if we had one more.
I think.
No, so now we're into the sprites. Yeah. So the Sprite series is the last to bloom in order in terms of the creeping phlox. The Sprite series has 3 colors, and I think we do have all 3 colors in the slide. So we have rose, and then we have magenta, which is a darker pink, and then we have purple. Yep, we have all 3. And so not only are the sprites a little bit later to bloom, so they're going to be later than the subulatas, later than the spring blings and the mountainsides, but they're also slightly taller. So all of the other categories are all more in that 4 to 6 inch height range. The widths vary depending on the types, like the spring blings tend to get up to about 28 inches in width. Some of the subulatas will get that large. Some of them stay a little bit more narrow in terms of their spread. But the sprites do get just slightly taller. It's not much of a distinction, but a couple inches taller, so more like 6 to 8 inches. And they have a little bit more woodland type parentage in them, so they will take a little bit more partial shade, whereas all of the other creeping type phlox really do want, purely full sun. This one does great in full sun, but it'll also tolerate a little bit of partial shade.
Great.
So then we jump into the next category of phlox that we offer here at Walters, which are hybrid upright phlox. So these are different than the creeping phlox, but they're also different than the tall garden phlox that a lot of people know, which are Phlox paniculata. So the hybrids have various parentage in them. Some of them have some paniculata in the parentage. Some of them have other varieties. But a couple key distinctions. One, they are earlier to bloom. So they're typically about 2 to 3 weeks earlier to flower than any of the paniculatas. So where the creeping phlox have basically wrapped up blooming, like Diane mentioned, in Chicago area, as well as here in Michigan, the hybrid types are not quite started yet, but they're definitely budded out in the landscape. So they'll be starting here usually in like mid to late June, early July is kind of their peak bloom time, at least in Michigan. And then the paniculatas don't start until mid to late July. So it's usually about 2 to 3 weeks difference. The other differences are that the hybrid types are all very good repeat bloomers. So they will kind of repeat bloom on their own. And then also if you were to shear them back after their first bloom, they would reflush into another bloom for you. So much better repeat bloom. And then kind of the third, actually there's 2 more distinctive traits. One of them is in terms of the habit. So these are definitely a little bit more of a spreader than the upright type, the upright paniculatas. The paniculatas are more of a clump former. They will, spread and widen a little bit, but the hybrid types do travel via like a rhizome. They're not invasive. They're not going to take over, but they will spread that way. And then lastly, they're not prone to the mildew that tends to plague a lot of the paniculatas. So they don't get, or I've never seen them get powdery mildew, whereas a lot of, especially the older genetics on the paniculatas will get that. So the first one that we're showing here is called Cloudburst. This is one of our older hybrid types in the Proven Winners program, just really pretty pink. And you can see as the flowers age, you get a little bit of color variation there. I'm going to talk about the other hybrids.
Sure. So as far as the other hybrids go, we have 2 different series. There's the Opening Act series and the Fashionably Early series. Would you say the Opening Act blooms before Fashionably Early or around the same time?
Around the same time. They're both pretty early.
Yeah, so they're blooming around the same time. The main difference between the series is going to be the height of the plant. The Opening Acts are a little bit shorter stature than the Fashionably Earlies. The Opening Acts have a really nice floral presentation, and you can see in some of these photos where the flowers are, covering majority of the plant. You only have like really a little bit of leaves showing at the base, and most of that plant is just covered in flowers. So that's a really great thing, really great characteristic of the Opening Act series. This first one called Pinkadot has some nice creamy white petals with a nice pink eye in the center. And then I believe next we have Blush.
Can I ask a question first before we go on? They want to know the height of the Opening Act series.
Yes. So I think Laura jotted down some notes. Those are zones. let's see, height.
Yep.
Opening act is going to be 18 to 28 wide.
That's height.
Okay, 18 to 28 high by 18 to 36 wide. So they can get a little bit wider than they are tall. And then fashionably early is going to be more in the 28 to 36 inches tall and 26 to 30 wide. So a difference of, you know, half a foot to a foot between the two series.
Right. And then what about
varies.
zone hardiness? Are most of these hardy to zone 4 maybe?
Yes. So what we let people know is zones 4 to 8 is what tends to be good for both of these series.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Next one is ultra pink.
Ultra pink. There we go. So ultra pink is a very eye-catching, nice, bright pink. Really catches your eye in the garden. Probably one of the most like neon colored hybrid phloxes that we have. So that's ultra pink, and being in this series, you know, you can see it's got that great flower color as well, flower cover across the majority of the plant as well. Let's see. We've also got blush and white in that series. So you can kind of get all of the colors if you want to stick within that series. And then
that's the opening act series also has those. Okay, sorry, I'm flipping too quickly. So opening act has the Pinkadot, the ultra pink, and what are the other two?
It's also got white and blush to round out the series. The Pinkadot and the ultra pink are the newest colors that have been added to the series.
Excellent.
Yeah. And then we've got the fashionably earlies. So we've got fashionably early crystal. We've got flamingo, which is more of an orange color. We've also got princess, which is pink. And then that's it for that series. So some similar colors in that series, but you get more of like a bright orangey pink with flamingo. And you get that height difference. That's the main difference with that series. And then, like Laura was saying, with these hybrid phloxes, really an improved performance as far as powdery mildew is concerned. And everyone knows that that's kind of the bane of phlox existence out in the garden. So
I think that's everybody's first question is, what do I do about the powdery mildew on my phlox?
Yeah.
Okay. You ready for the next slide?
Sure. You want to talk about Luminary?
Sure. So the Luminary, then this starts into the regular paniculatas. So these are your tall garden phlox that everybody's familiar with. The Luminary series is one that we first introduced a couple of years ago. And this is a series that's in the Proven Winners program, and they have all been selected to have very good, clean, dark green foliage and very good resistance to mildew. So nothing we're never going to say anything is 100% resistant to powdery mildew, because that would just probably not be accurate, but they're very good resistance. Typically, if you're going to get any, it's going to be much less to a much less degree than other varieties. So this is the most recent introduction, this backlight that's a nice pure clean white, just a little bit of a kind of light celery green eye in the center of it. And then the next one is, I think, opalescence. So this was one of the initial introductions and is kind of what we consider the poster child of the series in terms of the resistance to mildew. So this one probably has the best resistance to mildew of any so far that we've introduced. Nice light pink with that darker pink eye to that one, and really nice dark green foliage. And then the last one is ultraviolet. So this one has that really nice bright color, similar to Nikki, if you're familiar with that older variety. But again, that nice clean foliage, good mildew resistance, and nice sturdy habits in the gardens as well. And I saw a question pop up on the height. So the Luminaries get up to about 36 inches in height, ranging from 28 to 36 inches, and then about 20 to 32 inches wide.
And gain
So I have a
hardiness zone there too.
Oh yeah, hardiness.
Yeah. So 3 to 8 on those versus the hybrids are 4 to 8.
So I have a question on your breeding, and I know that everybody's working on more flowers, a bigger flower head possibly. So going along with that, does that mean you have to look at stronger stems? Is there a fine balance between having a lot more flowers on a plant versus having that strong stem? And is that traditionally something you are working on with the taller garden phlox?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're working on with the phlox and just about anything else that we're breeding with. Whenever you're creating a bigger flower power display, you definitely have to keep the strength in mind and the lodging. The last thing we want is big, beautiful flowers that flop over either at retailer or in the garden. So that's definitely something that we are looking at in the habit of the plant. The other thing that's big, not just in phlox, but in a lot of genera that we breed in, is the disease resistance, especially as people breed various traits into plants. Sometimes that brings with it, or it can bring with it, less resistance to disease if you're not careful. But Hans Hansen, who is our lead breeder, just has this unending knowledge of plants, and he's very careful that when he makes crosses for certain traits that he's keeping, other traits that could be bred into it in mind as well. So definitely breeding for disease resistance, in addition to stem strength, flower coverage, new flower colors, extended windows and flowering. If we can find something that blooms a little bit earlier and a little bit later than the other standards, that can bring some additional interest to those varieties. And just nicer habits, tidier, more polished habits, is another thing that we tend to look for.
Yeah.
And I know we get a lot of questions here about, oh my gosh, I mean, we've talked about lilacs before, and we'll be talking about more for this year. And then with the garden phlox, and people are always saying, oh my gosh, I love them, but they always get this, they always get that. And our message is, hey, the breeders are out there working really hard to make you more successful and hopefully take away some of these problems. So what you guys are talking about is exactly what we try to tell everybody, is there's a reason that there's some of these newer hybrids coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and absolutely. Some of the newer hybrids are beyond a doubt better performers. And there's plants in my own yard that are much older genetics, and I love them too, and they're great too. But there's definitely a place for the breeding and a place in all of our yards for new and old plants. So
yeah. And one thing I was just going to add, just about having bigger flowers and not having the plants flop over, is that Hans has really found a way to get blooms to form further down on the stem so that you get more bloom coverage over the whole plant, and then you're not putting so much right up at the top. So that actually increases the amount of flowers without making them more top heavy. So that's one great thing about his breeding, that kind of stands apart from other people's.
Great.
Yeah.
Now, which one of you would like to talk about pollinators? Because somebody is asking, would these be good for our bird and butterfly garden? So there's probably two questions here. There's birds that are pollinators, and then there's the rest of our pollinator friends. And then what about wildlife in general for other birds? I guess part of the question would be, do they set seed that the birds would eat in fall and winter? But kind of two questions there, if you guys want to address those.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in terms of birds, not that I'm aware of, I don't think that they set any seed that the birds are going to be eating, not like a coneflower, or something like that, where the birds will definitely come and feed on the seeds throughout the winter. Hummingbirds may come to them. I think especially some of the darker pink colors would be attractive to hummingbirds. Again, I don't necessarily think that this is one of their favored flowers. They tend to really go for those tubular shaped. There's certain flowers that are really super attractive to hummingbirds, and I don't necessarily think this is one of them. But they are good pollinator plants. You will see bees and butterflies come to them quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And do we have additional colors here? Do you want
I think there was one more slide that covers our other series in paniculata, which is the Garden Girls collection. And this collection has 4 colors now, but I think I just included one, which is kind of the best known and everybody's favorite, which is Glamour Girl. So Glamour Girl is this really kind of corally, orangey tinged pink that, especially from, you know, far away in the garden, just really catches people's eyes. This and all of the other Garden Girls members are also good resistance to mildew. Probably not quite as on par with, you know, the Luminaries in terms of that, but still very good resistance to mildew. And I think that was the last slide.
Yes, that was. So before I take this one off, because I just love the beautiful pictures, somebody wants to know if you're working on a deep red color for Phlox. Might that be in the future?
So I don't always know everything that Hans is working on. He is working on probably 80 different projects at any given moment. And we do get some sneak looks sometimes. I don't remember seeing any deep reds, but that doesn't mean he's not working on it. He may well be, so.
And let's hear a couple other questions before we move on to some of the general ones that had been asked earlier. How are you able to direct the creep direction of creeping Phlox? Can you, should you?
You can. It's going to take a little bit of maintenance. I would basically wait until it's done blooming. So around this time, once it's finished your bloom, is when you can do some trimming on it, whether that's taking out, you know, sometimes you get a little bit of winter dieback or winter burn. And now is a good time to trim that out, but it's also a good time if it's spreading in a direction you don't want it or getting bigger than you want it to, you can cut it back. You may have to do some pulling of it because as it creeps, it does tend to root in. So you may have to do a little bit more than just trimming. But yeah, you can definitely do it, but it's going to take some maintenance.
Yeah, you can always put like rocks around it to kind of direct, because it's obviously not going to grow into the rock. So if there's a direction you don't want it to go, you can kind of guide it using rocks. A lot of people like to use subulatas and some of the hybrids in rock gardens as well, because they tend to play well with rocks. So.
Yes, I do think of them as kind of a rock garden and a spiller over the top of the rock garden. So that's really good. Okay, I'm gonna go back to we talked about the types of Phlox. So and we talked about breeding. So let's start to talk about growing conditions for Phlox. What kind of soil? You touched a little bit on sun. And while you guys talk about that, I'm going to take this PowerPoint off the screen. So if anybody sees the pretty pictures disappear, don't panic. It's part of the plan. And we'll just look at our speakers for the rest of our session.
Oh boy, I don't know. You should probably leave that picture up there. So let's see what you asked about the growing conditions.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, majority of Phlox are going to want full sun or as much sun as you can give them out in the garden. Typically we would consider that to be 6 or more hours of sunlight, direct sunlight. And then in terms of soil or moisture conditions, the main differences are going to be between the creeping types and both the hybrid and the paniculatas. So the creeping types can and should grow in a little bit more poor to average soils, a little bit lower moisture conditions, so they can deal with kind of lower to mid moisture ranges, whereas the hybrid uprights and the paniculatas do best in more moderate to even fertile soils and like more of the average water moisture conditions, so not really quite as dry as the creeping type Phlox.
And what about fertilizer feeding the Phlox? Is there a need? And if so, when should you do it for the different types?
So sorry if you could hear that. I had an email pop up on the screen. So in terms of fertilizer, a lot of perennials don't even need much fertilizer. Phlox is one of the heavier feeders. What I'll do a lot of times with a lot of my perennials in the garden are the ones that need more feed. is to put down some compost in the early spring, just kind of spread it around on the top. You can, mulch over it after the fact if you want to or whatever. And then with phlox, some people will go in and feed them again in kind of like late spring to early summer. You definitely don't want to do it much later than that, because you don't want to give them a bunch of fertilizer and try and push new growth on them going into the fall when they should be kind of naturally, slowing their growth and starting to shut down for winter. But something kind of balanced, like a 10-10 or a 25-20 is a good fertilizer. But I honestly don't do anything other than Osmocote, or I'm sorry, other than compost. And so far I haven't seen any deficiency symptoms or anything like that. What do you do, Caitlin?
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing things to maintain your garden beds, like adding compost, you generally don't need to add too much fertilizer. And if you do, you want to use something balanced. And soil testing is never a bad idea either, to do that every few years and just see where your levels are at, because you don't want to ignore things like pH. If something's getting out of balance, then you want to do something to correct that. But you don't want to go in there blind and do anything drastic without knowing some information first. So soil testing is a great idea.
Good point. A lot of times we start our webinars by saying maybe two of the most important things. I hate to state most important, but two very important things for gardeners. Number one, know your growing zone. And number two, test your soil. That's going to tell you whether or not you even need to do anything with your soil. You may have great soil, so you don't want to waste time and money putting something on that you don't need. So know your growing zone and test your soil. Thank you for that reminder. We do have a question about the pruning. Pruning the paniculata phlox, will this increase flower size or simply delay the bloom? So that's a key question about when to prune. And then she makes a statement about her older plants seem spindly in bloom presentation. So I think there's three questions there if you want to answer all of those.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the pruning first. Generally, you don't want to do too much pruning as they're coming up in spring. Sometimes we do some pinching or trimming on young plants to encourage branching. But generally, once they're out in your garden, you don't really need to do much pruning as they're coming up in the spring. If you do that, you're going to take that terminal bud off of something like a paniculata, and you're going to miss out on that nice big first terminal bud that you see that everybody's looking for on their Phlox paniculata. The hybrids can tolerate a little bit more trimming. For instance, in the greenhouse, to kind of keep height down on them, or to delay flowering if we need them for a certain event, we might go through and trim them if they're getting close to flowering and we're like, oh, don't flower yet. So they can tolerate a little bit more of that, and you can even after the blooms have passed, go through and trim to get rebloom a little bit quicker, more quickly. Now the creeping types, you generally don't want to trim. If you are going to do any sort of trimming, like Laura said earlier, you're going to wait until the blooms have passed on those before you do any sort of cleanup or trimming on those. And then as far as the spindly flowers, maybe Laura can speak to that. It sounds like a little bit of maybe some older genetics and possibly some lighting conditions might be affecting that.
Yeah, those were a couple of my thoughts too. It could be, depending on how long you've had it in the garden, it could be an older variety that just has a little bit more spindly growth. If it is getting a little bit more shade than what it really, prefers, that's a lot of times when you'll see that spindly growth too. Another possibility could be if you're feeding it too much, or if it's in an overly fertile soil, that can sometimes lead to too lush of growth, which then becomes more weak and spindly and not as, lush and strong as under ideal nutrient solutions or conditions. So those would be my kind of three thoughts of why it could do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it was making me think of the webinar that we did with you last week, Laura, was shade gardening with perennials. And sometimes, you know, if you're in a house or if you're in an area for a while and you start out with maybe immature trees or young trees, the more they grow, the more shade you're going to get. I've had this experience where all of a sudden everything was just trying to reach for outside of the shade of that tree, and they got really spindly. Once I transplanted them to a sunnier spot, they just flourished. So
Yep.
yeah, you kind of have to
Absolutely.
grow as your garden grows and adapt to
Mhm.
all these changes. So yeah, that's, to me, that's what it sounds like, is possibly it got shadier.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see here. A few questions about how long it takes for Phlox to establish.
Yeah, so I would say it kind of takes that first year for most any perennials to get established. In terms of that first year that they're in the garden is when I would pay closer attention to your watering. They haven't had as long to root into the surrounding soil and to, you know, have that root growth established to be able to take up as much water. But typically by the second year, they're fairly well established in terms of being rooted in, as long as they're healthy and doing well. In terms of growth, a lot of times you'll hear the little phrase sleep, creep, leap. And that applies to some things more than others, like hostas. That's a huge one, but it definitely applies to a degree to phlox as well. So the first year is sleep, where you're not going to see them doing a ton above ground. But they're definitely doing a lot underground in terms of rooting. The second year is creep, where you're going to see a little bit of growth addition on the top that's visible to the eye. And then by the third year is really when you start to see them take off. So in that sense, kind of 3 years to really get established.
And then what about dividing how many years might it be before you need to divide your Phlox?
You want to take that one, or?
Well, it does depend a little bit on the space that you want them to have there. If you're fine with them having a nice big clump, you can kind of shape that clump and just remove, you know, parts of it. But generally it's recommended every 3 to 5 years that you kind of break up that clump. Otherwise you might start to get some dead spots in the center of the clump.
Any tips on dividing either the taller Phlox or the creeping Phlox?
Ooh, I don't know if I have creeping Phlox tips. Maybe you do. For the tall Phlox, you want to generally do it going into fall, correct? And so that's when those plants are kind of putting the resources back down into their roots anyway. So if you move it during that time period, it's got most of its resources down in the critical part of the plant when you're moving it. And it's also a time where you're going to have less water stress. Probably summer would be not a great time to do any dividing or transplanting, just because it becomes more difficult to give the plants enough water when at a time where you're disturbing the roots. So I think that's what's most critical for most plants.
Yep. The only other thing I would add to that, that I think a lot of people don't think about when they're gardening in their home garden, and that is sanitation of tools. And it may sound like overkill, but there's definitely plant viruses and things out there that you don't want to be spreading. So I would suggest you can, you know, bleach your shovels to clean them between moving things or dividing things.
Alcohol is a good
Alcohol,
tool sanitizer as well, just rubbing alcohol.
So basically, probably before and after when you're using your tools, because you never know, is that probably the best suggestion that you have?
Unless you're super well organized and like adamantly, you know, sanitize and then hang it up in the garage or the tool shed. If you're like me and it, you know, wanders around the yard, then who knows? So yeah, then I would definitely do it before and after.
You just made me feel a lot better to know that I'm not the only one who's not super organized with that. That's really good. So when you were talking about dividing, that was for both creeping phlox and garden phlox. It applies.
Yeah, I mean, creeping phlox are a little bit different in terms of divisions. That would apply to both the hybrid and the tall garden phlox. With the creeping phlox, the crown of the plant itself is not so much dividable, but once it has spread enough to where it is rooting in, as it spreads, then you could divide chunks out. I would still apply the same criteria though, either do it in the spring or in the fall. Definitely avoid summertime, especially with creeping phlox that has that evergreen foliage and is very prone to or can be more prone to desiccation. You want to be careful that you're, keeping it adequately watered after you divide or transplant. So, yeah.
Say in general, creeping phlox doesn't need as much maintenance as far as divisions go.
Great, makes it easier for us.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about containers? Would you suggest growing them in containers? If so, which ones would do better? And will they overwinter in a container? Maybe not. What should you do to them? So let's just, I know everybody loves to grow in containers. So maybe a few tips and discussion about that.
Yeah. So I think most perennials you can do in a container, including phlox. I would probably lean towards using the hybrids and the tall garden phlox more than creeping, but not to say that you couldn't put a creeping phlox in a container. But I think you have to go into it knowing that it may eventually outgrow the container and that you'll either have to, dispose of it and put something else in there or transfer it into the ground and start over. I think you can keep it in for a few seasons at least, though. In terms of overwintering, depending on what zone you're in, you can put it into an unheated garage. If you're in a zone, a lot of times what you can do is if it's hardy to a zone colder than what you are, it'll oftentimes overwinter in a container as long as you're not getting a bunch of freeze thaw cycles in the container. So like I tend to grow hostas in containers, and I'll either put them in my garage or else I'll like tip them on their side so that they don't get water into the container, or put them under, some sort of an overhang or whatever.
Yeah.
So that would be my thought with the phlox.
You lose some insulation when they're not in the ground. So you can imagine that root system is up above the ground, where it's susceptible to lots of cold air. And like Laura was saying, freeze thaw if water is getting into the container. So you're going to lose a couple hardiness zones when you do that. So just have to keep that in mind.
So when you bring them into your garage, I'm going to try this year. When you bring them into the garage over winter, do you cut them back and then do you bring them in the garage? Do you protect them with anything? Do you water them while they're in the garage over winter?
Depending on what it is, I will cut it back. Like if the foliage goes down and dormant, I will trim that off. I typically do not water at all winter. And then in the spring, usually I'll actually start to see a little bit of new growth starting in the garage before I even get them outside. And that's when I'm like, oh man, I got to get these plants outside. And then as soon as you put them outside, then start watering them as normal. And then, right away, you'll see that foliage start to take off. And I had a bunch of heuchera in my garage in containers this winter, and they were dark, like black varieties. One of them that I had was called Evening Gown, which is a newer dark leaf, kind of ruffly heuchera that we introduced. And the new foliage was looking very chartreuse. and when I pulled it out and it saw some sunlight, it now they look great. So.
Yeah, I used to overwinter some hardy ferns in containers in my garage. And one time they were climbing up through the wire of the shelves that I had them in. I'm like, oh, time to take those back outside. And they were very, very pale green. Took them outside. It's amazing how resilient they are. There's no doubt.
Yes.
Let's see here. There was another question about, it says some of the species of creeping phlox are evergreen. Did you guys talk about that? Sorry if you did, if you already mentioned it.
We haven't.
Okay.
Yes, and some of them are. So it definitely makes them a little more susceptible to dry down, especially with the fine root system as well. Like it's something that we pay a lot of attention to in the greenhouse when we're potting them up into containers. You really don't want to let that fine root system desiccate at all, or the top of the plant either. So it becomes really critical to characteristic you want to pay attention to, especially if you are trying to transplant, that you want to keep that moisture level up when it hasn't set in enough of those fine roots into the soil to support itself. They can desiccate pretty quickly. So that's one tip to when you're initially planting them in the garden. You may need to pay attention a little bit more with those creeping types to watering, because that root system is a lot shallower and they're trying to support these thicker evergreen leaves on top.
Yeah, and that's also why you do sometimes see winter burn on the creeping type phlox, because they have that evergreen foliage. It's the same as, on like a rhododendron or an azalea or some of the evergreen conifers, or arbs and stuff will see winter burn too. Anything that's evergreen like that, they are just more apt to desiccate over the winter. But typically on the creeping phlox, it's not so severe where in the spring you'll get that new foliage that comes up and covers over the old foliage, or you can cut that off after the bloom and they'll be fine. I don't typically see as harsh of a winter burn on them as on some of the more, upright evergreen plants that are much more exposed to the elements than the creeping phlox are. And a lot of people, use wilt proof or cover and burlap for some of the trees and stuff. I wouldn't suggest that on a creeping phlox because it's so low to the ground that I think that's going to create more problems in terms of trapping moisture in around that plant for the winter. And you definitely don't want that. That'll probably lead to dying. So
yeah, we don't want to do that. I mean, that's the whole purpose here of this webinar. Let's not let them die.
Yeah.
So we know the value, and we've been talking about the newer hybrids, but of course we all have some older ones around. And we did talk about maybe moving some from under trees that have gotten larger, to put them in more sun where they will do better. Are there any other tips that you can suggest to make great grandma's phlox thrive and look great in your garden? Like what things can you do? What is in your control to make them look healthier and bloom better?
Moisture management comes to mind, since most people struggle with powdery mildew. As much as you can keep those leaves dry, that's better. So sighting is important. Need to be in full sun. The more time that they have to dry their leaves in the sun, if you have to do any overhead watering, the better. You'll have less incidence of powdery mildew, and anything you can do to prevent having overhead water, like if you can have any sort of drip irrigation or sub irrigation in your garden, that helps with that as well. Anything else?
Perfect.
The only other thing that I would mention in terms of, because if you have the older varieties, inevitably you are going to get mildew. It's just going to happen, especially later in the season, and especially if it's a pretty humid and or rainy season. So there are some things that you can spray if you're apt to do sprays in your garden. My favorite one that would be actually available to homeowners is one called Eagle. And that is it's a product that contains the active ingredient miclobutrazole. And I would say of anything available to the homeowner, that would probably be my go-to. It's one that you can use in slightly different formulations in the industry, in the greenhouse, and I've used it successfully before on various things that get powdery mildew. So that would be my suggestion if you want to spray in your yard.
You
What
can
did you call
also,
it? Eagle?
Eagle, like the bird eagle.
Eagle?
Yep.
And is it a fungicide then?
Mhm.
Okay.
if you're looking for something that's a little more softer chemistry and a little more organic, it has to be used as a preventative. This will not help if you already have powdery mildew, but there's a product called bicarb, which basically just changes the pH of the water when it contacts the leaves, and it makes the plants more resistant to growing that powdery mildew. But like I said, you have to put it on preventatively.
And then as far as garden design, I mean, to me, it makes sense if they're spaced further apart, there's going to be more airflow, which should help. But then visually, it's not quite that stunning mass of flowers. So it's kind of like, which one do you want, right?
Yeah, I think that it just depends on your design style. Like if some people do that where they'll plant more interspersed, one here, one here, one here, one here, and still have masses, but it's more of a spread out mass. But yeah, that's not my style. So that's not how I plant regardless. So.
Okay. And if you do get powdery mildew, do you trim back that foliage and toss it so that there's less chance of it staying in your garden?
Yeah, there you definitely should be looking for it and scouting, because if you catch it early, you can absolutely help prevent it from further spreading by taking off the infected leaves. But, if you're not paying attention and all of a sudden you walk out and look at them one day and they're just covered in
white.
Yeah, it's too late by then.
Yeah, so it's too late for that year.
Yeah.
Should you were saying take off the leaves. What about cutting off the whole stem? Is that not a good idea in late summer?
I would definitely cut them down and dispose of that plant material before going into fall if they're infected. I wouldn't just put it in your compost pile or, till it into your ground or anything like that. I would get rid of that. If there's still some green at the top of the plant, though, depending on where in the season you are, I'd probably leave it unless you're really, into the fall.
Yeah.
Okay.
You probably get some healthy new growth at the base, and cutting out at least some of those stems while leaving some photosynthetic tissue intact can help.
Okay.
And it will create more airflow in there, which should help preserve some of the newer foliage at the base.
Okay, good. We were, Laura, you were an AAS judge in another life, and we surveyed some of our judges for some of their best gardening tips. And the one that I really liked said a gardener's best tool is his own shadow, meaning you're out there looking and patrolling and observing and picking weeds, pulling weeds, trimming off powdery mildew leaves, etc. So I just like the way they said that. The gardener's best tool is his own shadow or her own shadow.
Yeah, that's good. I like that too.
Yeah. Okay, what about, we're gardening and we've got Mother Nature and she provides all kinds of cute little critters. So what about deer? Do deer love phlox? Do they hate phlox? Where is it on that scale of deer resistance?
So I have seen both deer and rabbits eat phlox. I don't think it's necessarily a absolutely preferred plant, but it's definitely not one that's on their do not touch list. They will eat it. Rabbits, I don't know. I have a series or a species of mutant rabbit in my yard that eats anything and everything. And I think they love my phlox, but I don't know if they're standard rabbits because I think that they were placed there to, just aggravate me. So I don't know if you have any other rabbit experience.
Yeah, generally so your best friend in your garden is to have some diversity of plants, and to plant intersperse things that deer don't like, prickly things, fuzzy things, maybe some toxic things, just to kind of act as somewhat of a deterrent. Don't make it super easy for them to come and mow down their favorite things. So I feel like that's the best thing, but that's been my experience, is that they will eat it. It's probably not at the top of the list of their favorites, with like lilies and and hostas, but it's not something that they prefer to not eat. So interspersing things that they prefer to not eat is helpful.
It's always
for
a good
there.
idea, right? Yeah. Okay, what about insects, slugs, beneficial insects? I mean, do some phlox attract beneficials? Are there other insects that you really don't want on your phlox, or is it like, it's okay, they're not going to do that much damage? What about slugs?
Mhm. Hopefully you won't get too many slugs. Slugs tend to be an issue if you're in lower light conditions and with more moisture. So typically we don't see a lot of slug activity on phlox. Sometimes if you are seeing slugs, maybe you can dial back the water a little bit. And then in the greenhouse, thrips tend to be our biggest issue. Outside, that's not typically an issue, but they do provide a lot of pollen in those flowers. So you're going to get a variety of beneficial things visiting those plants, as well as some things that tend to be pretty incidental. They're not good, they're not bad. So definitely when you're looking at the phlox, they are going to attract a variety of organisms, and they're not all bad. I'll say that.
Yeah, and you probably would have some thrips in your flowers out in the garden, but out in the garden, there's enough, natural predation going on that I've never really seen thrips become an issue out in the garden. The only things that I've ever really seen get to be too problematic would be more like spider mites and aphids outside. And those aren't as big of issues on the phlox as on some other things. So
you might get some like 4-line plant bug visiting. They make the little like square punch holes on the leaves. But typically they're not like decimating the plant. Everyone's got to eat. So
Yep.
I don't generally see any insect pests just take out the phlox. It tends to be more disease related.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the newer varieties don't have that issue as much. So that's all good.
right.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask for your favorite combination. So what 1 or 2 or 3 things do you really like with creeping phlox? And what do you like with garden phlox? And you guys can bounce back and forth if you want, but I thought that might be a fun way to close out our hour, because we're almost finished already with an hour. But yeah, I'm kind of thinking, for me, for that spring creeping phlox, I love when the daffodils pop up there. So that's mine, is to get that purple, blue, and yellow combination, but those are just some of my favorites. Sorry if I took one of yours. But yeah, I'll toss it to you. What do you guys, what's your favorite plant combinations in the garden for a garden phlox and or a creeping phlox?
So for the garden phlox, I really like, so I've had some pictures that I've taken of phlox ultraviolet, the one that I showed with the really deep kind of magenta purple flowers, planted near a pennisetum that's pretty new, called Lemon Squeeze. Was that yours too? Yeah. And the color contrast is just to die for, because you've got this beautiful, rich, purpley violet color with this like chartreuse, and the texture is also very different. That is like my favorite combination with the phlox, I think.
Yeah, and if you throw something like a darker foliage in there too, like we've got it's new to the Proven Winners line of items, the geranium boom chocolata, with that, where it's like that dark purpley, almost black foliage, or black pearl or evening gown heuchera. What a combo.
Yes. Mine's think alike,
Yeah.
I guess.
Oh, I like the
Um,
sounds of that. That sounds gorgeous. You're going to have to send me a picture of it. Send me a picture and I can put it in the email then when we send out, because I like the idea. Any of these that you say are your favorite combos, if you send me an email this afternoon and I'll wait for that before I send out the newsletter. I think everybody
Okay.
would love to see that.
Okay.
Any
So
other combinations?
I thought of a creeping fox one that has been my favorite spot in my garden this year. So in the background, I've got a red leaf Japanese maple, and then I've got a golden carex everglow.
Mhm.
And then in the forefront of the carex, there's lupines and North Hills Phlox
Ooh.
subulata.
Mm.
So the little bling of white in the front, it just sets it off.
Do you have a picture of that?
Yeah, I do. I can send the picture.
Okay. Yeah, you got to send me a picture. I want to see that because I've got a Japanese maple that's red that I would love. Yeah. Okay. You have to tear up the rest of the stuff that's under there. So, but that's part of gardening, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Always changing it up. You always see something
Yep.
you like better.
Yep.
Oh my goodness. Okay. We have gone just a little bit over an hour. So I want to thank you guys so much. Very interesting. Always love hearing more about some of our year of crops, and we can share some of the information on our social media channels and everything. Like I said, we have recorded this, so we'll send out a summary with any additional links and photos that you guys send me. So we really, really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Go out and enjoy your phlox that is blooming right now, hopefully. So thank you, Laura. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you to everybody on this webinar. It was great information, and happy gardening.